It was an ordinary Tuesday in London, the kind where autumn leaves skittered across damp pavements and the afternoon light faded earlier than anyone was quite ready for. Kit Harington pulled his coat tighter against the October chill, his breath forming small clouds in the air as he walked briskly through Covent Garden. He'd just finished a meeting with his agent about an upcoming theatre project, something small, intimate, a chance to return to his roots after years in the spotlight. Fame had changed so much about his life. The ability to walk unnoticed through London streets had become a luxury rather than a given. Today, with his beard slightly grown out and a simple wool cap pulled low, he'd managed to blend in with the tourists and locals rushing through their day. It felt good, normal in a way his life rarely did anymore. Kit paused at a coffee stand, ordering a simple black coffee. As he waited, he watched people pass by. Businessmen in tailored suits, students with backpacks slung over shoulders, tourists consulting maps on their phones. This was London, as he'd always loved it, anonymous, diverse, everyone lost in their own stories. Coffee in hand, he decided to take the long way back through some of the smaller streets he'd wandered as a drama student years ago. The nostalgia felt comforting. Before Game of Thrones, before the worldwide recognition, he'd been just another aspiring actor, filled with dreams and doubts in equal measure. His mind drifted to his time at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. Those formative years had shaped him not just as an actor, but as a person. The lessons, the late-night rehearsals, the camaraderie with fellow students, and most of all, the teachers who had believed in him before anyone else did. One teacher in particular came to mind, Walter Lyons. The man had been a revelation to Kit and countless other students. Walter had a way of seeing potential that students themselves couldn't recognize. He was demanding but kind, brilliant but humble. In Kit's second year, when doubt had nearly overwhelmed him, it was Walter who had taken him aside after a particularly difficult rehearsal. "You have something special," Walter had told him, his voice low and certain. "Not just talent, that's common enough. You have the capacity to truly inhabit another person's experience. Don't throw that away because the path is difficult." Those words had sustained Kit through countless rejections, through the years of small parts and uncertainty before his breakthrough. He hadn't seen Walter in years, though he'd sent a note after landing the role in Game of Thrones. Walter had responded with a simple card. "I told you so." No congratulations, no fawning, just that quiet certainty that had always characterized him. As Kit rounded the corner onto a narrow street lined with old bookshops and cafes, something caught his attention. A small gathering of people had formed a loose semicircle near the entrance to an alley. Some were walking past with uncomfortable glances. Others stood watching with the detached curiosity of those witnessing something unsettling, but not quite alarming enough to intervene. Kit slowed his pace, curiosity drawing him closer. As he approached, he could see they were gathered around a man sitting on the ground, his back against the brick wall of a bookshop. The man was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a weathered face and clothes that had clearly seen better days. Beside him sat a small cardboard sign and a paper cup with a few coins inside. Something about the man's posture, dignified despite his circumstances, made Kit pause. The man wasn't asking for attention or making a spectacle. He simply sat, eyes downcast, occasionally murmuring thanks when someone dropped a coin in his cup. Kit was about to continue walking. He'd seen homelessness in London his entire life, had donated to shelters, had even volunteered occasionally, when the man shifted slightly, reaching for a battered paperback beside him. The movement was so familiar, so characteristic in its grace despite stiffness, that Kit froze mid-step. He knew that gesture, had seen it countless times in rehearsal rooms when Walter would set down his notes to demonstrate a scene. No, it couldn't be. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. But as the man raised his face slightly to turn a page, the profile became unmistakable, even beneath the unkempt beard, and the weariness etched into every line. Walter Lyons, the brilliant drama teacher, who had shaped generations of actors, who had directed acclaimed productions at the National Theatre, whose analysis of Shakespeare had been published and taught, was sitting on a London street, homeless. Kit stood transfixed, coffee cooling in his hand, the world narrowing to this impossible scene before him. How had this happened? Walter had been retiring when Kit was in school, yes, but he'd been respected, established. There had been talk of a book deal, of guest lectures at Oxford. As he watched, a teenage girl dropped some change into Walter's cup. "Thank you, my dear," Walter said, his voice still carrying that distinctive resonance that had commanded attention in lecture halls. The girl nodded and moved on, never knowing who she'd just encountered. The realization crashed through Kit's initial shock. Walter didn't just look homeless, he was homeless. This wasn't some method-acting exercise or research for a role. This was real. Kit stepped closer, heart pounding. Should he approach? Would Walter even want to be recognized like this? Pride was a powerful thing, and Walter had always had it in abundance. But the alternative, walking past, pretending not to see, was unthinkable. "Walter," Kit said quietly, moving closer so that only the older man could hear him. Walter looked up, confusion momentarily clouding his eyes, before recognition dawned. For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across his features, quickly replaced by the composed expression Kit remembered from countless acting critiques. "Mr. Harington," Walter said, his voice still carrying that precise elocution that had intimidated and inspired students in equal measure. "This is certainly unexpected." Kit crouched down, bringing himself to eye level. "Walter, what?" He stopped himself. There were too many questions, none of them appropriate for this moment. "It's good to see you," he said instead. Walter's laugh was short, devoid of humor. "Is it?" "I rather doubt that." "It is," Kit insisted, meaning it more than he could express. "It's been too long." Around them, passers-by had begun to take notice. A few had recognized Kit, phones subtly raised to capture the moment. The small crowd was growing, murmurs rising, as people realized who was crouching in the street. "You're drawing attention," Walter noted, glancing at the gathering onlookers. Always did have a flair for the dramatic entrance. The familiar critique, delivered with the same dry wit, made something twist in Kit's chest. This was indeed Walter, the same sharp mind, the same dignified presence, despite circumstances that should have crushed both. "Come with me," Kit said suddenly. "Let me buy you dinner or coffee, whatever you want." Walter hesitated. His hands, once so expressive when demonstrating scenes now reddened from the cold, tightening around his book. "I don't need charity, especially not from former students." "It's not charity," Kit said. "It's a chance to catch up. I've owed you a proper thank you for years." Something in Walter's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "You've done well for yourself. I've seen your work." "Because you taught me how," Kit replied, the simple truth of it momentarily, choking him. "Please, Walter, just dinner." The crowd had grown larger now, people recognizing Kit Harington crouching beside a homeless man, their phones capturing every moment of the exchange. Kit was accustomed to being watched, being photographed, but he hated the idea of Walter becoming a spectacle. After what felt like an eternity, Walter nodded. "Very well, but somewhere quiet if you don't mind. I find I've lost my taste for crowds." Kit helped Walter gather his few possessions, the book, a worn backpack, the small cardboard sign. As Walter stood, Kit was struck by how frail he seemed. The man who had once commanded rehearsal rooms with his presence now moved carefully, each motion deliberate. They walked slowly away from the growing crowd, Kit subtly positioning himself between Walter and the curious onlookers. He led them to a small pub on a side street, an old favorite from his student days, chosen specifically because the owner had always fiercely protected patrons' privacy. Inside, Douglas Myers, the owner, recognized Kit immediately, but said nothing. Beyond a nod of greeting, he showed them to a corner table in the back room, well away from windows and other customers. "Order whatever you'd like," Kit told Walter once they were seated. Walter studied the menu with careful attention. "The shepherd's pie, I think, and perhaps a cup of tea." Kit ordered the same, plus a bottle of water. When the waitress, Lisa, Avila according to her name tag, left, silence settled between them. "I don't know where to begin," Kit admitted finally. "Most scenes benefit from starting in the middle of the action," Walter replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Skip the exposition. It's usually tedious." Kit smiled despite himself. "Still teaching, I see." Old habits. Walter folded his hands on the table. They were clean but weathered, nails neatly trimmed despite his circumstances. That detail hit Kit harder than anything else had, the effort to maintain dignity when everything else had been stripped away. "What happened, Walter?" Walter sighed, looking past Kit to some middle distance. "The predictable, I'm afraid. A series of unfortunate events, as they say. My pension fund collapsed. Bad investments, it turned out. Then medical bills. My sister, Janice. Baron, you wouldn't have known her. Needed care, cancer. I sold my flat to pay for treatments that didn't work. She died anyway." He spoke without self-pity, laying out catastrophe in the same measured tones he'd once used to analyze character. Motivations. "After that, well, housing in London isn't exactly affordable on a retired teacher's remaining savings. I stayed with friends for a while. Brent Christensen was particularly generous. But one can only impose so long." "You should have reached out," Kit said, a note of accusation creeping into his voice despite his best intentions. "To any of us. All of your students." "To beg from those I taught?" Walter cut him off. "To trade on relationships formed in classrooms? No, that was not an option. It wouldn't have been begging," Kit insisted. "It would have been allowing the people who care about you to help." Walter's gaze, still sharp despite everything, fixed on Kit. "Pride is a luxury the destitute cannot afford, yet it's often all they have left. Judge that if you must." The arrival of their food provided a welcome interruption. Kit watched as Walter ate with careful precision, neither rushing despite evident hunger nor affecting disinterest. "How long?" Kit asked finally. "On the streets. Nearly 8 months now." Walter took a sip of tea. "The shelters are overcrowded, often dangerous. I found quiet corners, doorways where shopkeepers don't chase you away immediately. The library during the day, Alexandra Vaughan at the reference desk pretends not to notice I'm not actually researching anything. I still have my library card, you see. Small mercies." Kit listened, trying to reconcile the distinguished professor he remembered with the reality before him. "And before that? Hostels. Rooms when I could afford them. Corey Anderson let me stay. In his garage for a while, but his wife, Brittany Case, was less enthusiastic about the arrangement." Walter shrugged slightly. "People's charity has limits, as it should." Outside the pub windows, dusk was settling over London, lights beginning to flicker on along the street. Kit could see Walter taking note of the time, a subtle tension entering. His posture. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" Kit asked. Walter's hesitation was answer enough. "I have a spare room," Kit said. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm. Mr. Harington." "Kit, please." "Kit, then." "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not a charity case or a good deed to make you feel better about your success. That's not what this is about," Kit insisted, leaning forward. "You changed my life, Walter. You changed all of our lives. Let me help because I can, because I want to. Not out of pity or guilt, but because you matter." Walter's eyes, still that penetrating blue that could dissect a performance with a glance, studied Kit's face. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. One night, he conceded, and then we'll discuss more reasonable arrangements. As they finished their meal, Kit noticed Lisa Avila, their waitress, watching them from across the room. She wasn't the only one. Word had spread. Kit Harington was in the pub with a homeless man. Several patrons were sneaking glances, whispering behind hands. Lisa approached their table as they finished eating. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "Are you... I don't want to intrude, but..." Kit braced himself for the usual request. For a photo, an autograph, but Lisa surprised him. "Are you Professor Lyons?" she asked, addressing Walter directly. Walter looked up, startled. "Ah, yes, though it's been some time since anyone called me Professor." Lisa's face lit up. "I knew it. I was in your 6-week community workshop at the National 10 years ago now. You directed us in scenes from the cherry orchard." Recognition flickered in Walter's eyes. "Lisa, you played Varia." "Yes." She beamed, clearly delighted to be remembered. "That workshop changed everything for me. I didn't pursue acting professionally, but the confidence it gave me..." She shook her head. "I just wanted to say thank you." Walter's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "You're very kind to remember." "Everyone remembers," Lisa said earnestly. "Daniel Tate from that class is directing at the Young Vic now. He quotes you constantly." As Lisa walked away, Kit saw Walter blinking rapidly, his gaze fixed on the table. "You've touched so many lives," Kit said quietly. "Not just mine." "And yet here we are," Walter replied, his voice steady again. "Yes, here we are," Kit agreed. "And tomorrow will be different." As they prepared to leave, Kit noticed something happening around them. Lisa was speaking to Douglas Myers by the bar, gesturing in their direction. Douglas nodded and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he approached their table. "Professor Lyons," he said formally, "your meal has been taken care of." Walter frowned. "Mr. Harington was already..." "Not by him," Douglas interrupted gently. "By the house. My daughter Alyssa Anderson studied with you at Central 10 years ago. She's Dr. Anderson now, surgeon at King's College Hospital. She says she owes her public speaking confidence to you." Walter opened his mouth, closed it again. "And Lisa asked me to give you this," Douglas continued, placing a small envelope on the table. "Said it's from the Tuesday staff, whatever that means." After Douglas left, Walter opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a handwritten note and several 20-pound notes. "For the man who taught us to find our voices," Walter read aloud, his own voice barely audible. "From the Tuesday night workshop crew, with gratitude." The emotion that passed across Walter's face was complex. Pride warring with gratitude, shame with acceptance. Outside the pub, the evening had fully settled in, streetlights casting pools of gold on wet pavement. As they stepped out, Kit noticed several people waiting. Not fans looking for him, but ordinary Londoners. A nurse still in scrubs, an older couple holding hands, a young man with dreadlocks and paint-spattered jeans. "Professor Lyons," the nurse stepped forward. "I'm April Johnson. You judged our school drama competition in 2011. You told me I had extraordinary presence and should consider drama school. I didn't become an actor, but I used the confidence you gave me every day with my patients." One by one they approached, people whose lives Walter had touched in ways big and small. A student from a weekend workshop, an usher from a production he'd directed, the daughter of an actress he'd mentored. Each had a story, each remembered something Walter had said, had taught, had demonstrated through his own love of theatre and literature. And as they spoke, others gathered, drawn by curiosity at first, then caught by the stories being shared. Kit watched as Walter stood straighter with each encounter, the weight of shame visibly lifting as he was reminded of the legacy he had created, not in possessions or prestige, but in lives touched and changed. By the time they finally continued on their way to Kit's flat, a small crowd had gathered, many wiping tears away as they listened to stories of how one teacher had changed the trajectory of so many lives. "I had no idea," Walter said softly as they walked. "That's the thing about teaching," Kit replied. "You plant seeds and rarely get to see the forest that grows." Walter nodded, his steps steadier now, his gaze no longer fixed on the ground. "Tomorrow," Kit said, "we're going to figure this out. You've given too much to too many people to be forgotten like this." As they rounded the corner toward Kit's building, Walter paused, looking back at the twinkling lights of the city he had called home his entire life. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in theater, we're taught that every character believes they're the hero of their own story." He smiled faintly. "I never imagined I'd be the one in need of rescuing." "Not rescuing," Kit corrected gently, "reminding of who you are and what you mean to people. The rest is just details we can sort out." Walter nodded, and together they walked toward warmth and shelter and the promise of a tomorrow where things could begin to change. The crowd that had witnessed this reunion, this recognition of a man who had changed lives through his teaching, dispersed slowly into the London night, many wiping away tears, all carrying with them a reminder of how a single life, a single teacher, could touch so many others. And somewhere in that crowd, someone had captured the moment on video, not knowing that by morning it would touch thousands more, a testament to the ripple effect of kindness and the power of remembering those who helped shape us into who we are. Dawn broke over London with a gentle persistence, pale light filtering through the blinds of Kit's spare bedroom. Walter awoke disoriented, the unfamiliar comfort of a real mattress momentarily confusing after months of park benches and shelter cots. The events of the previous evening came back to him gradually. The chance encounter with Kit Harington, his former student now a world-renowned actor, the meal at the pub, and the unexpected reunion with former students. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 63, Walter had never expected to find himself in such circumstances. He'd spent his life in service to the arts, to his students, living modestly but comfortably on a teacher's salary, expecting his pension to carry him through his twilight years. How quickly it had all unraveled. The smell of coffee drew him from the bedroom. He found Kit in the kitchen, already dressed and preparing breakfast. "Morning," Kit said warmly. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Walter admitted, accepting the offered mug with a nod of thanks, "though I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't some elaborate dream." Kit smiled. "Not a dream, though apparently we're trending on social media, which is a bit surreal." "I beg your pardon." Kit slid his phone across the counter. On the screen was a video. Someone had recorded their encounter outside the pub, the gathering of former students, the emotional reunions. The video had hundreds of thousands of views already, with comments flooding in. Nicole Reed posted it. Kit explained. "She was there last night, said she was in your Shakespeare intensive in 2014. Walter set the phone down without scrolling through the comments. "I remember Nicole. Brilliant Ophelia." He sipped his coffee, uncomfortable with the attention. "This is not how I wish to re-enter the public consciousness." "Maybe not," Kit acknowledged, "but it started something important." He hesitated. "While you were sleeping, I made some calls." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Calls?" "To other former students. Professional ones, people who work in theatre now. Gary Grant at the Royal Court, Christina Meyer at the Globe, Dawn McKee, who runs that new experimental space in Brixton." Kit placed a plate of toast and eggs before Walter. "They all want to help." Walter's hands tightened around his mug. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Kit insisted. "It's the theatre community taking care of one of their own. How many times did you stay late to help a struggling student? How many recommendation letters did you write? How many careers did you launch with your connections and your belief? Walter stared into his coffee, silent. Walter, you spent your life giving to others. Maybe it's time to let others give back. Before Walter could respond, Kit's phone rang. He glanced at it, then back at Walter. It's Emily Bender from the National. She wants to talk to you about something. He handed the phone to Walter. Just hear her out. With reluctance, Walter took the phone. Emily? Yes, this is Walter Lyons. Kit busied himself at the stove, giving Walter privacy while keeping an ear on the conversation. Walter mostly listened, occasionally asking brief questions. By the time he hung up, his expression had shifted subtly. They want me to lead a masterclass series, he said, the disbelief evident in his voice. A 6-week program on Shakespeare for their emerging directors program. Emily claims they've been trying to find someone with my particular insight for months. Kit smiled. Sounds perfect. Walter's eyes narrowed. Did you arrange this? I may have mentioned to Emily that you were in town and available, Kit admitted. But the National has always respected your work. The opportunity is genuine. Walter set the phone down carefully. It would provide some income, at least temporarily. And housing, Kit added. The National keeps apartments for visiting artists. Emily mentioned they'd have one available for the duration of the program. Walter's pride warred visibly with practicality. This feels engineered. Maybe it is, a little, Kit acknowledged, but only in timing, not intent. Your former students have wanted to help for months. They just didn't know how to find you. Walter was quiet for a long moment. 8 months on the streets changes a person, Kit. I'm not the teacher they remember. I disagree, Kit said gently. Last night, I saw exactly the Walter Lyons who changed my life. Dignity intact, mind sharp as ever. Before Walter could respond, Kit's phone pinged with a message. He glanced at it and smiled. We've been invited to lunch. Dana Jackson, she was a teaching assistant for your advanced directing course. She wants to discuss something with you. Walter sighed. You've been busy? I've been making up for lost time, Kit corrected. We should have been looking out for you all along. After breakfast, Kit convinced Walter to accept a change of clothes. Nothing flashy, just clean jeans and a simple button-down that had been a gift but was too large for Kit. They fit Walter reasonably well, and the transformation was subtle but significant. With his beard trimmed and wearing clean clothes, Walter looked less like someone who had been living rough and more like the distinguished teacher Kit remembered, albeit thinner and more weathered. They met Dana at a quiet cafe near the Thames. She greeted Walter with genuine warmth, though Kit noticed she was careful not to make a fuss or draw attention to his circumstances. Thank you for meeting me, Dana said, once they were settled with coffee. I've been wanting to discuss a project with you for some time. Kit mentioned as much, though he was light on details, Walter replied, his manner professional despite his circumstances. Dana smiled. I'm working on a book about the evolution of actor training in Britain over the past 30 years. Your methodologies at Central were groundbreaking, Walter. I'd like to dedicate a chapter to your approach and philosophy. Walter blinked in surprise. My teaching was hardly revolutionary. That's where you're wrong, Dana countered. Your integration of classical technique with psychological realism created a generation of actors who could move seamlessly between Shakespeare and contemporary work. Half the British actors making waves in film today studied under you, including our Kit here, she added with a smile in Kit's direction. I was merely one influence among many, Walter demurred. False modesty doesn't suit you, Professor, Kit teased gently. Dana leaned forward. The publisher is offering an advance for your contribution. It's not a fortune, but it's fair compensation for your expertise and time. Again, Walter's pride battled with necessity. Kit watched the struggle play across his former teacher's face, the instinct to refuse warring with the practical reality of his situation. "I would need access to my old notes," Walter said finally. "Most of my belongings are in storage. If they haven't been auctioned off by now." "They haven't," Dana said quickly. "Gregory Wiggins has been paying the storage fees. He said it was the least he could do after you helped him secure that fellowship at Lambda." Walter's composure cracked slightly at this news. Gregory remembered that? It was just a phone call. "A phone call that changed his life," Dana replied. "That's the thing, Walter. You never saw how many lives you touched because you were too busy touching the next one." The conversation continued, details discussed, plans made. By the time they left the cafe, Walter had agreed to contribute to the book and had the promise of another check, small but significant, to help him get back on his feet. Outside, the autumn sun had broken through the clouds, casting a golden light over the Thames. They walked along the embankment, Walter's steps steadier than they had been the night before. "Your friends are very kind," Walter said finally. "They're your friends too," Kit replied. "You just didn't realize it." They paused, watching a tour boat glide beneath Tower Bridge. "I lost myself these past months," Walter admitted, his voice low. "Not just the material things, my home, my possessions. I lost my sense of purpose, my identity. When you've spent your life being Professor Lyons and suddenly you're just another invisible old man on the streets." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You never stopped being Professor Lyons," Kit said firmly. "The circumstances changed, not the man." Walter gave a small, sad smile. "Kind, but not entirely accurate. Homelessness, it strips away your personhood bit by bit. People look through you, past you. You become part of the urban landscape. Noted, perhaps, as an eyesore, but rarely as a human being with a past, a story, a future." Kit was silent, recognizing the truth in Walter's words. "The most difficult part," Walter continued, "was the loneliness. Not just the absence of company, but the absence of connection, of being known." "Well, you're known now," Kit said quietly, "and not just by me." They continued walking, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, plays they'd seen, books they'd read. Kit was heartened to learn that throughout his ordeal, Walter had maintained his habit of reading, making use of public libraries during the day for warmth as much as for literature. As they approached the National Theatre, Walter's pace slowed. He looked up at the brutalist concrete structure with a complex expression. "I directed my first professional production on that stage," he said softly. 32 years ago. The Winter's Tale. "I remember reading about that production in my theater history course," Kit said. "Robin Frank played Leontes, didn't she?" Walter nodded. "She was magnificent." He stood straighter, memories seeming to fortify him. "Perhaps it's fitting that the National might provide shelter again in a different way." As if on cue, Kit's phone rang. "It's Lisa," he said, recognizing the number of the waitress from the night before. "Do you mind if I take this?" Walter gestured for him to go ahead, turning his attention back to the theater. "Lisa, hi," Kit answered, stepping slightly away. "Mr. Harington, I'm sorry to bother you." Lisa's voice came through, slightly breathless. "But after you left last night, something amazing happened. People started sharing stories about Professor Lyons, not just the ones who spoke to him directly, but others who overheard. Someone started a collection, and then Douglas matched it. And, well, we raised quite a bit." Kit glanced at Walter, who was still gazing at the National, unaware of the conversation. "That's incredible, Lisa." "There's more," she continued. "I posted about it on a theater alumni forum, and it's gone crazy. People from all over, former students, colleagues, people who saw his productions. They're all asking how they can help. Someone started an online fundraiser. It's at £15,000 already and still climbing." Kit felt his throat tighten. 15,000. Yes, And James Thompson, he's some big producer now. He's offered to match whatever is raised. By the end of the week, Lisa, I don't know what to say. We want to present it to him, Lisa said. Tonight, if possible. Douglas has offered to host a small gathering at the pub. Nothing too overwhelming, just people who want to help. Would you bring him? Kit looked at Walter again, wondering how the proud man would react to such a gesture. Let me talk to him. I'll text you. After hanging up, Kit rejoined Walter, who was still lost in memories. Everything all right? Walter asked. Yes, Kit said carefully. That was Lisa from the pub. She and some others would like to meet with you tonight. There's something they want to discuss. Walter's expression grew wary. More charity? No, Kit said firmly. Recognition, appreciation for what you've given to the theatre community over decades. Walter was quiet for a long moment. You know, when I first found myself on the streets, I kept expecting to run into former students. London's theatre world is small, after all. I used to rehearse what I'd say when it inevitably happened. He gave a small, sad laugh. But no one recognized me, or if they did, they chose not to acknowledge it, until you. I'm glad it was me, Kit said simply. Walter nodded. As am I. He straightened his shoulders. Very well, I'll meet with Lisa and the others, though I'm not entirely comfortable being the object of so much attention. For someone who spent his life on and around stages, you've always been remarkably averse to the spotlight, Kit observed with a smile. I preferred to focus it on others, Walter replied, to illuminate potential rather than bask in recognition. They continued their walk along the Thames, stopping occasionally for Walter to rest. Despite his brave front, months of poor nutrition and exposure had taken their toll on his stamina. During one such pause, Walter turned to Kit. May I ask you something? Of course. Why did you stop yesterday, truly? You must pass homeless people every day in London. What made you look twice? Kit considered the question carefully. I recognized your gesture, the way you turned the page of your book. It was so distinctly you. Before I even saw your face properly, some part of me knew. Walter nodded slowly. The body remembers what the conscious mind might forget. That's what I always taught about physical character work. You taught me well. Kit smiled. As afternoon faded toward evening, they made their way back toward the pub where they dined the night before. Walter seemed both nervous and resigned, like an actor preparing for an unfamiliar role. Whatever happens tonight, Kit said as they approached, remember that you changed lives for the better. That matters. Walter squared his shoulders. Lead. And then, they entered the pub to find it unusually quiet for early evening. Douglas Myers nodded to them from behind the bar, gesturing toward the back room. As they walked through, Walter froze in the doorway. The room was filled with people. Not just Lisa and the staff from the night before, but dozens of faces. Some familiar to Kit from his own drama school days, others unknown, but all focused on Walter with expressions of respect and affection. Professor. Lyons, Lisa stepped forward. We have something for you. In that moment, as Walter stood surrounded by the evidence of his life's impact, Kit saw the proud man's composure finally break. Tears welled in Walter's eyes as Lisa explained what they had done. The fundraiser, the matching gift, the outpouring of support from the theatre community. It's not charity. One former student, Christopher Fletcher, now a respected director himself, said firmly, it's an investment in the person who invested in all of us. As the evening unfolded, more people arrived, each with stories of how Walter had influenced their lives, their careers, their understanding of theatre and of themselves. Some brought practical gifts, offers of temporary housing, potential teaching positions, consulting opportunities. Others simply came to express gratitude long overdue. Through it all, Walter stood straighter, his eyes brighter, his voice stronger, not just from the promise of material security, but from the recognition of his worth, his impact, his place. in the community he had served so faithfully. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, Walter pulled Kit aside. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't do this," Kit replied, gesturing to the room. "They did. But you saw me," Walter said. "When I had become invisible, you saw me." Everything else followed from that moment. Outside, the pub, the streets of London glittered with evening lights, the city transforming as it always did from the practical bustle of day to the enchanted landscape of night. As they walked together toward Kit's flat, just for tonight, Walter had insisted, until he could sort out more permanent arrangements, Kit realized that something profound had shifted. The teacher had become the student, learning about the impact of his own life's work. And Kit, the student turned globally recognized actor, had perhaps delivered his most important performance, not on screen or stage, but in a simple act of recognition on a London street. Tomorrow would bring challenges, practical, matters of housing, employment, rebuilding a life. But tonight, under the London stars, what mattered was that a man who had spent his life helping others find their voice had finally heard the chorus of voices he had helped create, all singing back to him the impact of his own existence. And across London, as the video continued to spread, more voices joined the chorus, a testament to how a single life lived with purpose and compassion could touch countless others, and how those touches, those moments of true seeing, could return when most needed, bringing hope and renewal to even the darkest circumstances. Dawn broke over London with a brilliant clarity, unusual for the typically overcast city. In Kit's spare bedroom, Walter awoke to sunlight streaming through the window. For the second morning in a row, he experienced that momentary disorientation, the surprise of comfort after months without it. But today, something else accompanied that feeling, a cautious sense of possibility. On the bedside table lay tangible evidence of last night's events, a folder containing details of the fundraiser, now approaching £20,000, business cards from theatre professionals eager to work with him again, and a letter on National Theatre letterhead confirming his masterclass series. It hadn't been a dream after all. Walter dressed carefully in clothes Kit had insisted on purchasing yesterday, simple, dignified attire that fit properly. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man reflected there still showed the strain of months on the streets, but something of the old Walter Lyons had returned to his eyes. In the kitchen, he found not only Kit, but also Elizabeth Thompson, once his student and now a respected costume designer. Elizabeth insisted on bringing breakfast, Kit explained, gesturing to an impressive spread of pastries and fruit. She also has some news. Elizabeth smiled warmly. Professor Lyons, I've spoken with Sarah Moore at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. They're looking for a guest lecturer for their classical text program this spring. 3 months, with accommodation included. Sarah nearly fell over herself when I mentioned you might be available. Walter set down his coffee mug carefully. That's very kind, but I'm not certain I'm in a position to share your unparalleled knowledge with another generation of actors. Elizabeth finished for him. With respect, Professor, that's precisely what you're in a position to do. Your circumstances changed, not your expertise. Walter recognized his own words from countless classroom critiques, repurposed and returned to him. He smiled despite himself. Touché, Ms. Thompson. After breakfast, Elizabeth departed for a production meeting, leaving Walter and Kit alone. You've orchestrated quite a resurrection, Walter observed, not unkindly. Kit shook his head. I just made a few phone calls. Everyone else was already looking for ways to help. They just needed to know where to find you. He hesitated. There's something else we should discuss. The video from the pub has gone viral. Walter frowned. Meaning? Over 2 million views since yesterday. It's been picked up by several news outlets. They're calling it... Kit paused, looking slightly embarrassed. They're calling it Kit Harington's most heroic role yet. Walter barked a laugh. Absurd. I agree, Kit said, but it's bringing attention to your situation and by extension to the broader issue of homelessness among older adults. Several reporters have requested interviews. Walter's expression grew serious. I have no desire to become a poster child for social causes, however worthy. I understand that. But your story has resonated with people, Walter. Maybe there's a way to use that attention constructively. Walter was silent for a long moment. I'll consider it. Their conversation was interrupted by Kit's phone. After a brief exchange, he turned to Walter with an odd expression. That was Jill Vaughan from The Times. They're running a feature on arts, education funding, and want to interview you about the impact of budget cuts on performing arts programs. Me? Why? Because your situation has become symbolic of how we fail to value arts educators, Kit explained. They want to speak with you not just as someone who experienced homelessness, but as a respected authority on theatre education whose circumstances highlight a systemic problem. Walter considered this. Being interviewed as an expert rather than as an object of pity made the proposition more palatable. Perhaps that would be acceptable, he conceded. Later that morning, they made their way to the offices of a small theatrical foundation in Covent Garden. Stephanie Collins, the foundation's director and another former student, had offered Walter temporary office space to sort through the various opportunities suddenly before him. Professor Lyons? Stephanie greeted him with professional warmth, carefully calibrated not to embarrass him with excessive emotion. We've set you up in our conference room for privacy. There's a computer, phone, everything you might need. Thank you, Ms. Collins, Walter replied formally, though Kit noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he shook Stephanie's, evidence of how deeply these kindnesses were affecting him. The conference room was small but well-appointed, with large windows overlooking a courtyard. On the table lay several neatly arranged folders. These arrived this morning, Stephanie explained. Offers from publishers interested in your memoirs, invitations to speak at various institutions, and, she smiled slightly, a rather impassioned letter from your former agent, Scott Vasquez, who is, and I quote, furious that you didn't reach out to him immediately. Walter raised an eyebrow. Scott retired 5 years ago. Apparently, he's unretiring specifically to represent you again, Stephanie replied. He was quite adamant about it. Left alone in the conference room, Walter stared at the folders, the evidence of a life and career that hadn't been forgotten. After all, overwhelming, Kit asked gently. Entirely, Walter admitted. Yesterday morning I was concerned with finding a dry place to sleep. Now I'm fielding offers from publishers. Life can change quickly, Kit observed. In either direction, as you well know. Walter nodded soberly. Indeed I do. A soft knock interrupted them. Stephanie opened the door. Professor, there's someone here to see you. He's rather insistent. Before Walter could respond, the door opened wider and Richard Hines stepped in. In his 70s now, Richard had been Walter's colleague at Central for decades, co-teaching many classes with him. Walter, you old fool, Richard said without preamble, his voice gruff with emotion. Why didn't you call me? Walter stood momentarily speechless. Richard, after 8 months on the streets when you could have been staying with me. What were you thinking? You were caring for your wife, Walter said quietly. Michelle Williams was still recovering from her stroke. I couldn't impose. Richard shook, his head in exasperation. Michelle would have been delighted to have you. She always liked you better than me anyway. His gruff manner couldn't quite hide the hurt. We're friends, Walter. At least I thought we were. Of course we are, Walter said quickly. Friends don't let friends sleep rough, Richard countered, then softened slightly. But that's water under the bridge now. The question is, what's next? As the day progressed, The conference room became something of an impromptu command center. Richard remained, helping Walter sort through offers and opportunities. Scott Vasquez arrived, emerging from retirement with all his former energy intact, immediately taking charge of negotiations with publishers and speaking engagements. Kit observed it all with a sense of wonder. In just 24 hours, a community had mobilized around Walter, not just providing immediate financial assistance, but rebuilding the infrastructure of a professional life. By mid-afternoon, Walter had a tentative schedule for the next 6 months: the masterclass series at the Shoe National, the guest lectureship at RADA, a series of speaking engagements on classical text, and the beginnings of a book deal for his memoirs focusing on his decades in theatre education. "This is extraordinary," Walter said quietly to Kit as they took a moment alone. "I'm not entirely comfortable with so much attention." "You deserve every bit of it," Kit replied. "And more importantly, you've earned it. These aren't handouts, Walter. They're opportunities you're qualified for, that you should have been offered regardless of your recent circumstances." Walter nodded slowly. "Perhaps, though I suspect your name attached to mine hasn't hurt matters." Kit smiled. "My name might have opened a few doors, but your reputation is what's filling rooms." As evening approached, Walter insisted on returning to Kit's flat, rather than accepting Richard's invitation to stay with him. "One step at a time," he explained. "I need to adjust gradually." They walked together through Covent Garden, the area coming alive with evening theatre crowds. Walter moved differently now, Kit noticed. His head was higher, his gait more confident, small but significant changes from the man he'd encountered. On the street just 2 days ago, near the Royal Opera House, they encountered a small group of drama students rehearsing a scene in a public square, using the space as their stage. Walter paused to watch, his professional interest evident. The scene was from Romeo and Juliet, the famous balcony exchange, but the young actors were struggling with the language, rendering Shakespeare's poetry flat and lifeless. Walter watched for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly pained. Finally, he turned to Kit. "Do you mind if we stop for a moment?" Kit smiled, recognizing the look in his former teacher's eyes. "Not at all." Walter approached the students cautiously. "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I couldn't help noticing your rehearsal." The students looked up, initially wary, then curious as Walter introduced himself. "Professor Walter Lyons," he said simply. "I taught at Central for many years." "Wait," one student, a young woman with bright eyes, said suddenly. "Are you the Walter Lyons, the one from the video with Kit Harington?" Walter sighed. "Yes, though I'd prefer to be known for my work rather than my recent circumstances." "No, of course, sorry," the student said quickly. "I've actually read your analysis of Shakespeare's verse structures. We studied it in class. Something in Walter's posture shifted at this, a subtle straightening, a reclaiming of his professional identity. "Perhaps I could offer a suggestion about this scene," he asked. The students eagerly agreed, gathering around as Walter began to explain the rhythm and meaning of the text, demonstrating how the verse structure reflected the character's emotions. Kit stepped back, watching as Walter transformed before, his eyes becoming once again the commanding teacher he remembered. A small crowd gathered, drawn by Walter's passionate explanation and the students' increasingly improved performance. Kit noticed Lisa Avila from the pub among the onlookers, filming discreetly on her phone. After about 20 minutes, Walter concluded his impromptu lesson to enthusiastic thanks from the students. As they dispersed, the young woman who had recognized him approached again. "Professor Lyons, we have a rehearsal space near here. Nothing fancy, just a room above a cafe. Our director, Alvin Simmons, is struggling with our production. Would you consider coming to watch a run-through sometime? Give us some feedback." Walter hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be happy to." As they continued their walk, Walter seemed energized. by the encounter. They're quite talented, those young people, rough around the edges, but the raw material is there. Just need the right teacher to bring it out, Kit suggested. Perhaps, Walter acknowledged. They had dinner at a small Italian restaurant where the owner, Justin Murphy, insisted on treating them after recognizing Walter from the now viral video. My daughter, Tabitha Wilson, is studying drama, Justin explained. She says your book on audition techniques changed her approach completely. Walter accepted the hospitality with growing grace, more comfortable now with this recognition of his professional contributions rather than his recent hardships. After dinner, they returned to Kit's flat to find several journalists waiting outside. Word has gotten out where you're staying, Kit said apologetically. We don't have to talk to them. Walter considered the reporters, then straightened his shoulders. Actually, I think perhaps we should. Not about me specifically, but about the larger issues at play, about how quickly anyone can fall through society's cracks, regardless of their contributions. Kit nodded, proud of Walter's courage. Together, they approached the journalists. Professor Lyons will answer a few questions, Kit announced. Provided the focus remains on issues of affordable housing, support for the arts, and the challenges facing older adults in our society. The impromptu press conference lasted about 15 minutes, with Walter speaking eloquently about his experiences, not seeking pity, but illuminating systemic problems with the clarity and insight that had made him such an effective teacher. The true measure of a society, he concluded, is not how it treats its most fortunate members, but how it protects its most vulnerable. I have been fortunate in many ways, not least in having former students who recognized me when I myself had nearly forgotten who I was. Later, in the quiet of Kit's flat, Walter seemed drained but peaceful. You did well with the press, Kit told him. Theater training, Walter replied with a small smile. One learns to project authority, even when feeling anything but. Kit's phone buzzed with a message. He read it and looked up at Walter with an expression of disbelief. What is it? Walter asked. The fundraiser, Kit said. James Thompson made good on his promise to match donations. With his contribution and a few other major donors who've come forward, the total is now over £50,000. Walter sat down heavily. That's impossible. That's community, Kit corrected gently. Your community. Walter was silent for a long moment. I never thought of myself as having created a community. I was just doing my job, teaching my students. The best communities form naturally around shared values and mutual respect, Kit said. You taught us more than just acting techniques. Walter, you taught us to look deeply, to see beneath surfaces, to recognize the humanity in every character, and by extension, in every person. And now you've turned those lessons back on their teacher, Walter observed wryly. Full circle, Kit agreed with a smile. That night, as London slept, two men sat talking late into the night, the younger now guiding the elder, the student becoming the teacher, the cycle of mentorship reversing and renewing itself in the process. They spoke of plays and productions, of favorite performances and notorious disasters, of the peculiar magic that happens in the space between actor and audience. And as they talked, plans began to form, not just for Walter's immediate future, but for something larger, a foundation, perhaps, to support aging artists and educators. A mentorship program connecting theatre veterans with emerging talents. Ways to ensure that knowledge and wisdom weren't lost when careers ended, that those who had given their lives to illuminating the human condition weren't left alone in darkness. By the time exhaustion finally drove them to bed, something new had been born between them. A partnership, a collaboration between generations, founded on mutual respect and a shared vision for what theatre at its best could be and do in the world. Outside, London continued its restless dreaming. unaware that in one small flat, the seeds of transformation were taking root, not just for two men, but potentially for an entire community that had momentarily forgotten one of its own, and in remembering, had perhaps found a way to become more fully itself again. And as Walter drifted towards sleep, the weight of shame and invisibility that had pressed upon him for months began to lift, replaced by something he had not felt in a very long time: the quiet certainty of belonging. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful encounter on a London street. The morning air carried a crisp December chill as Walter stood before the mirror in his new flat, a modest but comfortable one-bedroom in Southwark, within walking distance of the National Theatre. The space had been secured through the theatre's housing program for visiting artists, available to him for the duration of his masterclass series, with an option to extend if his work with them continued. Walter adjusted the collar of his shirt, a new one, part of a small but dignified wardrobe assembled with the help of Richard Hines and his wife Michelle Williams. His reflection showed a transformed man from the one who had sat against a bookshop wall mere weeks ago. His beard was now neatly trimmed, his hair cut by Jacqueline Stevens, a former student now working as a stylist for theatre productions. The gauntness in his face remained, though less pronounced after weeks of proper nutrition. But the most significant change wasn't physical. It was the return of purpose in his eyes. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Walter opened it to find Kit standing there with 2 coffee cups and a paper bag. "Thought you might want fortification before the big day," Kit said, handing over one of the coffees. Walter accepted it gratefully. "Is it that obvious I'm nervous?" "Only to someone who knows what to look for," Kit replied, settling onto the small sofa. First day jitters are universal, even for veteran teachers. Today marked Walter's first masterclass at the National, the official return to professional life after months of invisibility. 20 emerging directors would be spending the next 6 weeks under his tutelage, exploring Shakespearean text analysis and staging techniques. "It feels rather like the first day of school," Walter admitted, sitting across from Kit. "I've been awake since 4, reviewing notes as though I haven't been teaching these concepts for decades." Kit smiled. "I remember you telling us that nervousness simply meant we cared about doing well." "Using my own lectures against me," Walter observed dryly. "How very astute." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence. Over the past weeks, their relationship had evolved from the former student-teacher dynamic into something closer to friendship, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine camaraderie. "There's something I wanted to discuss with you," Kit said finally. "The foundation idea we talked about, supporting artists and educators who've fallen on hard times." Walter nodded. "You've been pursuing it?" "Yes. I've spoken with Stephen Carter and Megan Yang. They're entertainment lawyers. They've drawn up preliminary paperwork. We could register it as a charitable organization by the new year if we move quickly." "And the funding?" "Starting with the remainder of your fundraiser money, about 30,000, after your immediate needs were met. Several industry people have expressed interest in contributing, including James Thompson and a few others from the film world." Kit hesitated. "We need a name for it." Walter considered this. "What about the Recognition Foundation?" Kit tilted, his head questioningly. "Because that's what made the difference for me," Walter explained. "Not just financial assistance, but being recognized, being seen when I had become invisible." "The Recognition Foundation," Kit repeated. "I like it. And I'd like you to be its public face," Walter added. "Your name carries weight that mine doesn't." Kit shook his head. "We'll be co-founders. Your experience and perspective are essential to its mission." Before Walter could respond, his phone chimed with a message. Since reconnecting with his professional network, Walter had reluctantly entered the world of smartphones. His ancient flip phone replaced with a device Barbara Jackson from the National's administration had helped him set up. "It's from Emily Bender," Walter said, reading the message. "Apparently there's quite a crowd gathering for the masterclass. She wants to know if I'd mind a few observers in addition to the enrolled directors." "Define a few," Kit said with a knowing smile. Walter's brow furrowed as he scrolled through the subsequent messages. "Good Lord. There are theatre critics from 3 major publications, a documentary filmmaker, and, is this right, the Minister of Culture." Word got out, Kit said simply. "Your return to teaching has become something of an event." Walter set the phone down with a look of mild alarm. This was meant to be a quiet re-entry into professional life. "Nothing involving the London theatre community is ever quiet," Kit reminded him. "Too many dramatic personalities." Walter couldn't argue with that. He finished his coffee and stood, gathering the portfolio containing his teaching materials. Well then, best not keep them waiting. They walked together toward the National Theatre, the December sun casting long shadows across the Thames. As they approached, Walter slowed his pace, taking in the iconic concrete structure. "I always found it rather ugly," he admitted. "Yet there's something powerful about its presence, isn't there? Unapologetic, substantial." "Like good acting," Kit suggested. Walter smiled. "Precisely." Inside the National's lobby, Emily Bender was waiting, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "Walter, there's been a change of venue," she said after greeting them. "We've had to move your masterclass to the Dorfman Theatre." Walter blinked in surprise. "The theatre? Why?" "We've had over 100 requests to observe the class," Emily explained. "Industry professionals, former students, current students from various institutions. The standard classroom simply won't accommodate everyone." Walter paled slightly. "I was expecting 20 directors in a studio setting, not a public performance." "It's still a masterclass," Emily assured him. "Just with a slightly larger audience." She checked her watch. "They're ready whenever you are." Walter stood motionless, a flicker of the old uncertainty passing across his face. Kit recognized the moment for what it was, a crossroads between the past and a possible future. "Walter," he said quietly, "you've performed on that stage before." Walter nodded slowly. "A lifetime ago, it seems." "The space knows you," Kit continued, "and you know how to command it." Walter took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and gave a short nod. "Very well." Emily led them through the backstage area to the Dorfman Theatre, the smallest of the National's 3 venues, but still substantial, with its 450-seat capacity. From the wings, Walter could see that it was nearly full. Rows of faces, many familiar, some unknown, all waiting expectantly. On stage, 20 young directors sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and awe. A table, with water and Walter's materials, had been set up at the center. 5 minutes, Emily told him, squeezing his arm encouragingly before disappearing to the back of the house. Walter turned to Kit, a rare vulnerability in his expression. "I'm not sure I can do this." "You already are," Kit replied. "Look at them." Walter glanced out at the assembled crowd again, this time taking in individual faces. There was Robin Shields, who had played Ariel in Walter's production of The Tempest 15 years ago. Seth White, once a struggling student who now directed at the Royal Court. Kevin West, who had dropped out of Central but found success as a playwright. Faces from different decades of his teaching career, from different productions, all there because of their connection to him. "They're here for you," Kit said softly. "Not out of pity or obligation, but because you matter to them." "Because what you know and what you teach matters," Walter nodded, emotion making speech momentarily impossible. "Break a leg, Professor," Kit said, stepping back as Emily signaled that it was time. Walter walked onto the stage, the familiar boards beneath his feet triggering muscle memories from decades of theatrical experience. The house lights dimmed, slightly, focusing attention on the stage. The audience quieted, expectant. For a moment, Walter simply stood there, taking in the scene before him. Then, in the commanding voice that had shaped generations of actors, he addressed the room. "Theatre," he began, "at its essence, is an act of recognition, of seeing and being seen, of acknowledging the full humanity of another person, whether they be character or actor, audience or artist." He paused, his gaze sweeping the theatre. "Today, we begin by recognizing each other." For the next 2 hours, Walter led a masterclass that those present would later describe as transformative. He worked with the young directors on a scene from King Lear, demonstrating approaches to text analysis that revealed layers of meaning in even the most familiar passages. He moved with increasing confidence around the stage, his passion for the material overcoming any lingering self-consciousness about his circumstances. The audience sat rapt, many taking notes, others simply absorbing the masterful teaching unfolding. Before them, Kit, watching from the wings, saw not the homeless man he'd encountered on the street, but the formidable teacher who had shaped his own understanding of his craft. When Walter opened the floor to questions, dozens of hands shot up. The discussion that followed ranged from specific techniques to broader philosophical approaches to theatre. Through it all, Walter responded with the wisdom, humor, and occasional sharp criticism that had characterized his teaching style. As the session drew to a close, Walter addressed the room one final time. "I find myself in the unusual position of teaching again when I had thought that chapter of my life concluded. Recent events have reminded me that we are all, at various points in our lives, both teachers and students, helpers and those in need of help." He paused, his gaze finding Kit in the wings. "The true measure of any theatrical community, indeed, of any community, is its capacity to see each of its members fully, especially when circumstances have rendered them seemingly invisible." The applause that followed was thunderous, the entire audience rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Walter stood before them, accepting their recognition with a simple nod, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude and determination. Later, as they walked back along the Thames, the winter sun setting early over London, Walter and Kit discussed the day's events. "You were magnificent," Kit told him. "Every bit the teacher I remembered." Walter smiled. It felt surprisingly natural, being back in that environment, as though no time had passed at all. His expression grew more serious, though of course much has. "Emily mentioned they're considering extending your masterclass series into a regular position," Kit said. "Artistic Associate for Education." "Yes, she spoke with me afterward," Walter confirmed. "It's a generous offer." "Will you accept?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "I believe I will, yes, but with a condition." "What's that?" "That part of my role includes outreach, bringing theatre education to those typically excluded from it. Community centers, homeless shelters, underfunded schools." Walter's gaze was distant, reflective. "I've seen both sides now, Kit. The heights of artistic achievement and the depths of societal neglect. I'd like to build bridges between those worlds." Kit nodded, understanding. "The Recognition Foundation could support that work." "Precisely." They stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the city, London's lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. The river flowed steadily below them, constant yet ever-changing. "You know," Walter said contemplatively, "in classical dramatic structure, recognition, anagnorisis, is the moment when a character passes from ignorance to knowledge, often accompanied by a reversal of fortune. Like Oedipus realizing his true identity," Kit offered. "Exactly. But what the Greeks understood, what Shakespeare expanded upon, is that true recognition isn't just about external circumstances. It's about seeing oneself and others with new clarity." Walter turned to face Kit fully. "When you recognized me on that street, you initiated a kind of anagnorisis for us both. How so? For me, it was the beginning of reclaiming my identity beyond immediate circumstances. And for you? Kit considered the question seriously. I think it helped me recognize the impact teachers have had on my life, how much I owe to those who shaped my understanding of my craft. It's easy to forget that in the rush of career, of life. Walter nodded. A mutual recognition then. As they continued their walk, plans for the foundation taking clearer shape between them, neither man could have predicted the full impact their chance encounter would have, not just on their own lives, but on London's theatre community and beyond. In the months that followed, Walter would return fully to professional life, teaching, writing, eventually directing again. The Recognition Foundation would grow, providing support not just for artists facing hardship, but creating programs that bridged social divides through theatre. And Kit, despite his demanding filming schedule, would remain involved, using his platform to highlight issues of homelessness and arts funding. But the most profound change wasn't in the institutions they built or the work they created together. It was in the ripple effect their story had on those who witnessed it. In person that day on a London street, or through the video that continued to spread around the world. A reminder that sometimes the most important role we play is simply to see one another, truly see, and in that recognition, restore what has been lost. As twilight deepened over London, Walter looked back at the National Theatre, its lights, now glowing against the darkening sky. You know, he said thoughtfully, in the theatre, we often speak of coming full circle, returning to where we began but with new understanding. I never imagined my circle would include such a dramatic detour. Bishu, the best stories always have unexpected turns, Kit replied. Walter nodded, his expression peaceful. Indeed they do, and it seems ours is still being written. Together they walked on into the London evening, teacher and student, two actors in a larger drama neither could have scripted, yet both were now helping to direct, a story about recognition, renewal, and the enduring power of seeing and being seen.